Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Daniel Pasco Aguilar, founding director of the Center for Social Justice and Chief Diversity Officer at Excelsior University. We are thrilled to have you with us today. Excelsior University's leadership, the Center for Social Justice, and the Age and Generational Diversity Rope Team welcomes you to today's When Generations Connect keynote and discussion. For those of you who are not acquainted with Excelsior's rope teams, we have 13, soon 15 communities we call rope teams that we describe as representation and support villages around our students based on the dimensions of identity that matter to them and to allies. If you want to learn more about our rope teams or how to engage with them, you can visit them at communities.excelsior.edu, or you can contact the Center for Social Justice for more information. We have a very special guest with us today, Kelly Brinkman, an expert about the power of generational inclusion in the workplace and an experienced public speaker who has motivated thousands to pursue their academic and career dreams. Kelly, thank you so much for visiting us this afternoon. We are really honored to have you. And before I introduce you formally, or we introduce you formally, I had the pleasure of introducing Bonnie Ordonez, Director of Faculty Development, and Connor Hall, Social Media Specialist at Excelsior University, who have kindly offered to say a few words about intergenerational dynamics. So Bonnie and Connor.
Thank you, Danielle. Today, we're going to explore a crucial aspect of our increasingly diverse and interconnected world, intergenerational dynamics. As we gather here, we're surrounded by people from different generations, each with their unique experiences, perspectives, and values. This diversity can be a tremendous strength, but it also presents challenges that can impact our personal and professional relationships. Intergenerational dynamics refers to the interactions, relationships, and influences between people of different ages, backgrounds, and generations. These dynamics play out in various contexts, from families and communities to workplaces, social institutions, and educational settings. As we'll explore today, understanding and navigating these dynamics is essential for building stronger relationships, fostering inclusive environments, and unlocking collective potential. When interacting with or instructing adult learners of all ages, generations, and backgrounds, it's crucial to recognize the importance of intergenerational dynamics. By embracing diverse perspectives and experiences, we can create a learning environment that values and supports the unique needs and goals of each individual. This inclusive approach not only enhances the learning experience, but also fosters a sense of belonging, motivation, and engagement among learners. Let's take a closer look at some statistics that highlight the importance of intergenerational dynamics. By 2025, so now, the Society for Human Resource Management estimates that 5 generations will be working together in the workforce for the first time in history. This diversity can lead to increased innovation, creativity, and problem solving, but it also requires effective communication and collaboration. A study by Glassdoor found that 60% of employees believe that generational differences affect their work relationships. This perception can lead to misunderstandings, conflicts, and decreased productivity if not addressed. Research by the PwC reveals that employees who feel valued and included are 3.5 times more likely to be motivated to contribute to the organizational success. This highlights the importance of creating an inclusive environment that values diverse perspectives and experiences. In both educational and workplace settings, intergenerational dynamics can present both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, diverse age groups bring different skills, experiences, and perspectives that can drive innovation, growth, and knowledge sharing. On the other hand, differences in communication styles, work habits, and values can lead to conflicts and misunderstandings. Connor?
Thanks, Bonnie. As we navigate these dynamics, it's essential to recognize that each generation has its unique strengths and challenges. By embracing these differences and fostering an environment of mutual respect, empathy, and understanding, we can unlock this collective potential of our teams, organizations, and learning communities. This inclusive approach enables us to do a number of things: leverage diverse perspectives and experiences to drive innovation and problem solving, foster a sense of belonging and motivation among learners and employers, develop targeted strategies for communication, collaboration, and knowledge sharing, and create a culture of empathy, respect, and inclusivity that values diverse backgrounds and experiences. Today's discussion will focus on how to harness the power of intergenerational dynamics to build stronger relationships, improve communication, and drive success in our workplaces, educational institutions, and communities. We'll explore strategies for identifying and addressing generational differences, breaking down barriers, and creating an inclusive environment where everyone feels valued, empowered, and supporting in their learning and professional growth. Back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Connor. So before we pass the microphone to Kelly, I want to thank a number of people and units that made today's event possible, starting with Maria, Courtney, and Nyla from marketing, Erin, Stacy, Jason, and Connor from communications, Bonnie from academic affairs, Jamie and Mackenzie from development, our president and cabinet, and Jill and Lori from the president's office. Thank you so much for your amazing partnership and support. Also, at around 3:45, we will have time for a brief discussion about the contents of today's session. So please input your questions or comments in our webinar's Q&A space for Bonnie, Connor, and me to bring them up to Kelly. And if interested, you can indicate that you would like to be elevated as a panelist to ask your question visibly and verbally. So I can do that for you if you're interested. And now we have the privilege of introducing Kelly Brinkman. Bonnie?
Kelly Brinkman has become a guidepost of wisdom for Gen Z and millennials, imparting inspiration and valuable insights on navigating life's journeys and challenges. As a proud millennial herself, Kelly is driven by her commitment to fostering connection, passion, and a deep belief in the power of generational inclusion in the workplace. In her previous role, Kelly made a significant impact in the field of education. With over 2 decades of public speaking experience, she motivated thousands to pursue their academic and career dreams through her captivating presentation style.
Kelly's energy, positivity, and unwavering dedication to excel in everything she does have roots in her secondary career as an elite marathon racer. For nearly 15 years, Kelly trained and competed in events across the United States and around the world. Her accolades include earning a place in several U.S. national championship races, securing the title of national champion in the Masters Track 5,000 meter, and narrowly missing a spot on the U.S. World Team in cross country. Notably, Kelly's resilience was tested when she completed the Boston Marathon just 30 minutes before the terrorist attack in 2013. This experience has given her a unique perspective on the impact of history on a generation and how it can shape individuals.
As a self-proclaimed crazy dog mom, Kelly spends her spare moments volunteering at a local dog rescue. And we just learned that she has 3 beautiful dogs.
Yeah. With a 4th on the way.
Oh, goodness. With a unique blend of professional expertise, athletic achievements, and a heart for service, Kelly Brinkman continues to inspire and empower audiences to embrace their potential and make an impact in their workplace and their communities. Kelly, thank you for honoring us with your presence and presentation today. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me, and for everybody in our audience for joining today. I realize time is precious and you have studies to get along with, but I do really believe in BridgeWorks' mission, and that is to shed a light on why first of all, who the generations are and the qualities and attributes that they bring to the workplace, and then how we can better connect with one another and collaborate to be an intergenerational force, whether it's in our personal or our professional lives. Daniel, I believe, yep, there we go. I was going to share my presentation, some information to provide just sort of a background on who the generations are, what experiences shaped who they became as adults, and how and why each generation sort of exemplifies or exhibits similar characteristics from generation to generation. So first, to get everybody on the same page, I always like to outline who the four main generations are in the workplace. BridgeWorks is not counting Gen Alpha yet, although some sources certainly are, and they are up and coming faster than I can believe. But the four generations next, if we want to show, that we'll highlight include our first generation, which are our baby boomers. If we want to go ahead and advance, we'll look at our slideshow.
I'm working on that, and it's
Yep.
not working. We tried it, and now it's
We
not.
love
There we go.
technology. Yes, there we go. So if we go next, our first generation, if we can show, yeah, absolutely, is our baby boomers. These are folks born from 1946 to 1964. At their peak, they numbered 80 million. This was a post-World War II generation where one baby was being born every second. You can go ahead and advance. Our second generation in the workforce is going to be our Generation X. These are folks born from 1965 to 1980. They are our smallest generation, at their peak numbering 60 million. But due to significant economic and social changes, this was a generation that, although they were small, they are very mighty. Our next generation is going to be what we call the best generation. I'm just kidding. Because I'm a millennial, I get to say that. It's the millennial generation. These are folks born from 1981 to 1995. At the peak, they're our second largest generation, numbering 75 million. And the big hallmark of this generation is that they were the first generation of folks to have access to the internet and cell phones in their youth. And then last but certainly not least, our Gen Z people. These are folks born from 1996 to 2010, our second smallest generation, but our first truly digital native generation. They have never known a world without touch screens and TikTok. So these are our four generations. And as I think you can sort of see, and when you think about the societies that each of these generations represents, very different, very distinct societies, from Woodstock to TikTok, that we are dealing with these individuals. If we look at the next slide, we'll see the current generational composition of the workforce today. Because although the baby boomers were our largest generation, as our oldest generation that we'll discuss today, many of them have retired or are reaching retirement age. So the majority of our people in the workforce today are millennials, followed closely by Generation X. And for the first time in history, our Generation Zers are outnumbering those baby boomers. So if we want to advance the slide, what we'll do sort of next is talk about how our generations shape who we are. Now, it would be irresponsible of me to say that, generations is the only thing that shapes who you are as a person, your values, your beliefs, your behaviors. Other things certainly influence who we become, things like our geography and our culture, which are closely intertwined. If you grow up in a foreign country versus the United States, you will have different views on the world. Socioeconomic status, things like wealth or its lack thereof, will certainly shape your views of the world. And then lastly, family, if we want to advance, your position in your family. There's often said, certain characteristics of being the oldest child of the family, or certain characteristics of being the youngest. Or if we advance the slide, the dreaded position, I say jokingly and lovingly, of being that middle child. But I think we can all relate to sort of those markers, of how being an oldest child, a youngest child, or a middle child can affect how we feel about the world or the certain traits we might have. And that's what generations is all about, is looking at the sociological wide lens view of how the events and conditions of a certain period of time shaped the people of that time to become certain and exhibit certain traits and characteristics as adults. So if we advance, how this works or why this works has to do with the physiology of humans and the fact that during roughly our teenage years, our brains are not fully developed. They're very soft, so that everything we experience during those formative hallmark years leaves the most lasting and profound effect on our brains. It affects how we view the world, it affects our career choices, our behaviors, our morals, our values, all of that. And again, generations is about the fact that, people, the example I like to use is, people who grew up during the Great Depression have very distinct values and beliefs about money. Many of those people who grew up during the Depression grew up to be adults who did not trust banks, and even though the world changed between the Great Depression and their current day, their minds were most affected by those years during the Great Depression. So that's sort of how and why generations can be taught or looked at to guidance for how people will behave in a certain environment. If we want to advance the slide, I'll walk briefly through an example of, each generation grew up with different ways to communicate with one another. And those communication tools shaped how we view communication itself. Baby boomers who grew up with a rotary phone, sharing that household phone where you didn't have the ability to be flexible or mobile. You didn't have call waiting or answering machines. Everybody in the house had one phone that was connected. That shapes your concept when it comes to communication and what can be done. Generation X and millennials now have the ability to be a little bit more mobile with the invention of pagers and cell phones. And then Gen Z, for the first time in history, 95 to 98% of teenage Gen Zers in the United States have smartphones. So not only can they connect with one another, but they can connect to the internet, which is essentially the wild, wild west of information or misinformation, however you want to look at it. And again, that totally shapes your mindset, going from a sedentary house phone that you share with everyone to suddenly being 12 years old and being able to talk to anyone, anywhere in the world at the touch of a button certainly shapes your communication expectations and the way you communicate. If we want to advance, I'll quickly sort of walk through each generation, starting with our baby boomers, if we want to go ahead to the next slide. And I'll discuss a little bit of the events and conditions that were happening during their formative years, and then the traits that we see most often out of the generation based on that formative experience. Now, I'd like to remind people again here, will every single thing I say about a baby boomer apply to every single baby boomer? Absolutely not. But again, we are generalizing to the group based on the sociological studies and what we saw out of the outcome of the events and conditions that shaped them. So if we look at those baby boomers who grew up during, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, we saw them experience things like the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. We saw them experience things like the Vietnam War. They had the excitement of the first, man on the moon and the space race. And families and the social scene in the United States then was, very, very nuclear family based, and, everybody dressed in their Sunday best to go out on the town. And it was a very much more formal and sort of structured society that these baby boomers were growing up in. So if we advance and see, through those events and conditions that shaped them, the most common characteristics we see in the baby boomers when they show up in the workplace include things like being very idealistic. This was a generation that fought and changed the world because they had 80 million people. They said, if we don't like, segregation, we're going to fight for equal rights. If we don't like the war in Vietnam, we are going to protest for that. And so they have this idea that, if we want to change things for the better, we can. They were a very competitive generation because with 80 million people, they had to fight for every opportunity that came their way, whether it was a desk in a school classroom or a desk in the office. They learned that, you do what needs to be done in order to stay competitive and get a job and keep a job. If that meant showing up early and staying late, they made that sacrifice to be competitive. And then lastly, polished and professional. I often joke with my audiences that, back in the 1960s, if you were flying somewhere, because I fly a lot for my job, people at the airport in the 1960s were in their suits and their ties, and women were in their dresses and full makeup and hair done, because that was society. That was again a much more formal and structured environment. And now I go to the airport these days and we see pajama pants and Crocs. So again, when that's the world you see, your expectation is to be a little bit more polished and professional. And then lastly, if we think about the values, the biggest value and asset that baby boomers provide for us, if we want to advance, it is that value, that wisdom, that experience, that being in the workplace, that living through the successes and the failures has taught them, and that expectation of excellence, because that was the mindset when they were coming up in the world, of the professional world. And so we really need to lean into the tap into the wisdom, because I think we can all agree, the formal education system teaches us so much, but there are certain lessons that can only be learned, when you live through them. So those are our baby boomers. Next up, we're going to move on to our Generation X. So Generation X, these are our folks born from 1965 to 1980. And if we think about the world that was shaping their mindset, a few big things come to mind. Again, in the United States, one of the biggest hallmarks of this generation, unfortunately, was the fact that the divorce rate in America tripled during the Gen X youth. So we had this huge, family and economic shift happening for kids. We saw more single income homes. We saw more single parent homes. And so this phenomenon known as the latchkey kid phenomenon happened during Gen X. And that's where, because there was maybe only one parent in the household, or because both parents had to work, Generation X kids were oftentimes left to take care of themselves, where mom and dad, or just mom and dad, mom or dad was at work. So they'd go to school in the morning, armed with a key, they'd get home after work, let themselves in, do their own homework, maybe do their own chores, maybe even make their own dinner and put themselves to bed, because that was what they had to do. Also, during this time, something that exploded was cable television, right? Prior to this, there were maybe 4 or 5 major channels that played the news and very, very specific, sort of general, family friendly viewing programming. But during the 80s, we had this new invention of cable television, where now we have hundreds of channels, very niche channels. And a lot of these, again, latchkey kids are sitting at home, and the television became their babysitter. So we joke that they were sort of grown up, by MTV and CNN and these sorts of things. And that again had a new and profound shift in their mindset. And then the last thing was, again, sort of the beginning stages of the technological advancement, where we're moving from a very analog sort of society during the baby boomer era to now we have the first versions of computers. Oftentimes they weren't widespread. You maybe had computer labs at school or at businesses, but the home computer wasn't super prevalent, but we were moving towards that. If we look at the outcome of this generation who went through, the societal shift, there was a lot of economic turmoil during this time and recession. We'll see some of the main traits that showed up in Generation X as they came into the workplace. If we want to advance the slide, the biggest thing was probably this sense of independence and self reliance, because they grew up, again, a lot of them taking care of themselves. And so oftentimes these are folks in the workplace who don't lean on teams, or who don't naturally gravitate toward collaborative work because they're used to getting things done for themselves. They were also a skeptical generation because, like I mentioned, they saw, the American family sort of struggle, the American family structure, fail. They saw economic recession. They saw corporate downsizing. They saw layoffs. They saw, a lot of tough things that they witnessed in their youth. And this was before the sort of gentle parenting style, where parents really sat down and processed things with kids. And so they were left to sort of navigate on their own. And then lastly, efficiency. So as a generation that not only saw shifts from an analog workplace to a technology aided workplace, which allowed them to get more done, they also saw efficiency as a way to provide value in the workplace. The more work I can get done, the more valuable I am. And so, the economic uncertainty that they saw their parents struggle through, they want to avoid for themselves. So they learn to be very, very efficient on the job and taking care of themselves. All right. Now we'll move on to our next generation, which was our millennials, or which is our millennials. Oh, I'm sorry. Got ahead of myself. So if we're looking at the sort of the main personification of how Gen X shows up in the workplace, or the value they tend to lead with in the workplace, that self-reliant, confident sort of attitude that, you know what, I don't need to rely on anyone else. I can get the job done. And also focusing on results versus, getting maybe bogged down in processes, or who's in charge of what. It doesn't matter. Let's just get the job done. All right, now we'll move on to our millennial generation. Again, this represents the largest percentage of workforce in the United States at this point in terms of their generational representation. These are the folks born from 1981 to 1995. As I mentioned in the preview of each generation, the big hallmark for this generation was that increased prevalence and advancement of technology. So this was the generation that really saw the proliferation of the home computer advancing to, laptops, computers, and internet computers by the time they're going to college and in their later youth and early adulthood. They also saw the proliferation of cell phones, and once the cell phone started rolling out in 2007, we saw a new cell phone every single year coming out. And still to this day, I can't keep up with all the cell phones. And they also saw some unfortunate things, like the attacks on 9/11, which profoundly shaped our society. Generation millennials, younger millennials and Generation Z have never known a world where at the airport you don't have to check your liquids and go through the metal detector and take off your shoes. That was normal for those younger generations, whereas our previous generations, that was something they lived through. And then also, this was the generation I like to point out that was the participation trophy generation, which sometimes we can get picked on for. But let me remind you, our parents were giving us those awards and those recognitions. But it built up. There was a huge self-esteem movement, where it was like, from the Gen Xers who felt like they had to take care of themselves, to suddenly this millennial generation where, there's open dialogue with your parents. We're starting to address, how are you feeling about things? There's more of a back and forth dialogue, which again is going to profoundly shape the characteristics we see come out of millennials. So if we think about that and then process it to the main characteristics we see in millennials as adults and in the workplace, the strengths they bring. Number one, we're going to see their innovative side. Because again, they were the generation that lived through the new technology for the first time, really changing at a rapid pace. And so when you experience that as being your normal day-to-day sort of existence, you can't help but have that mindset when it comes to sort of everything in your sphere that you're dealing with. They're very experiential. This was a generation that had the first access to social media in their youth, where suddenly it became about sharing the experiences you're having. This was the generation that originated FOMO, that fear of missing out, right? Because every meal we had, every airport we went to, we were taking pictures and sharing those experiences with people. So again, in our workspace, we like to have similar types of experiences, whether it's retreats or learning sessions or workshops versus just stuff or just, things. And then the collaborative mindset. The younger generations, really, I would say, starting with millennials, their formative experience, whether it was in education or in activities, really leaned hard into the idea of teamwork and collaboration. And obviously, we point to social media as a part of that as well, because suddenly you're able to connect and do networking, which was often thought of as this professional skill and this professional outlet for people as an adults, as you're going, to seminars and conferences. Well, now kids can do it in their youth on their phones. They can connect with whomever over whatever topic they want from the comfort of their own bedroom. So this generation, again, grows up with this mindset that, like, the more we can share ideas, the more we can share connecting with similar or different people, the better outcomes we can have with the power of that collective intelligence and that crowdsourcing. All right. So if we look at sort of the strengths that millennials often bring to our professional and our personal settings, it's that more open communication style. They want to have a lot more dialogue about things. They want to have more openness about feelings and personal as well as professional elements of the job. And then looking at collaboration and innovation as powerful tools for advancement because they now have the technology to do that. And then last but certainly not least, we want to give a nod to our Generation Z. Now, a lot of times I think that people think of Generation Z as the quote unquote new kids on the block. But if you do the math, our oldest members of Generation Z have been in the workforce for almost, 30 years. So, or excuse me, 20 years. So, they're 30 years old. They could have 10 years of work experience already, which is, no short feat. So, they're definitely in a fluid generation because the youngest members of this generation are only 15, so they are still going through their formative years. But again, the oldest members have been on the work scene for 10 years. So if we think about the realities, and again, I want you to picture, forget everything you knew before the year 1996. If your memories and your brain and your concept of reality starts at 1996, think about how different that is from people's who realities and their lives started in 1946. I mean, that's a huge shift. So, how can our brains and how can our behaviors not also be wildly different, right? Because this is a generation that, as I mentioned in our opening, has never known a world without a cell phone in their hand, without constant connectivity. And those cell phones are supercomputers. They're not the old, brick phones that we had as millennials where we were playing Snake and texting in T9 word format. These are powerful, powerful tools. These are the types of people who, if you want to learn to do anything, you go to YouTube and you can how to any skill or any, recipe you want, and the resource will be there. They're living an on-demand life, whether it's excuse me, whether it's being a consumer and being able to order things through platforms like Amazon Prime, where something arrives at your door within hours or within a day, or whether it's the entertainment that we're watching. You can stream an entire season of television in one afternoon. I would not recommend it, but you can. This is a generation that's never had to sit and wait through a traditional commercial break or wait from week to week for an episode of your favorite show to air. So when you're thinking about, how they view advancement in the world and how they view advancement in a workplace, they often have a very accelerated mindset because everything in their life has been very accelerated, right? And they also have grown through and lived through COVID-19 as teenagers in their formative years. So, some of those most important years for developing social skills, for connecting with others, were spent social distanced, and we may not see how that fully affects this generation until again they're fully through their development cycle. If we want to advance and think about the qualities that have come out of this generation based on the world they live in, we'll see things like, if we advance, being risk averse. They have seen and they have had access to every and all information they could ever want. And so, whether it's, investing in their education or whether it's investing in a venture, even things like purchasing a home, the idea of Gen Z, number one, they talk about not being able to afford a home, but also there's this idea of, the housing market's been up and down. And so, they're much more pragmatic. They can do a lot more research and gather a lot more information before they make decisions, and they take advantage of that. And they're very resolute. This is a generation that, again, has grown up destigmatizing mental health. They have grown up in a culture that talks about feelings, that talks about emotions, that shows up as their authentic self at work. There is no more separation. If we think back to baby boomers, a lot of times, how baby boomers acted and dressed and behaved in the workplace was very distinct. And then how they acted, behaved, and dressed when they were at home was different. They had a work persona and they had a home persona, and they did not let the two intermix. And now, as we've moved through the generations, that line between work and personal has essentially disappeared with this Gen Z. And they want to be able to show up as themselves, and they will hold true to their beliefs and their values, even in the workplace. They will not sacrifice their personal beliefs to keep or get a job. And then lastly, coachable. So, one of the biggest critiques of this generation that we hear from outside organizations is that this is a generation that doesn't want to work, or they need too much hand holding. But let me clue you in on their formative experience when it comes to learning, education, and work. A lot of the time, the majority of the time, this was a generation growing up that was raised on rubrics, which means, and maybe some of you in your classes can relate to this. At the beginning of your term, your professor gives you a sheet and it says, if you want an A, this is what you need to do. And it is clearly defined for you. If you get a B, this is what you need to do. And they have been raised like that, and from education in their youth to education as adults. So when you show up on the workplace and there's no sense of direction or instruction, it can be very disorienting for them. And again, it's not because they're not equipped with the capabilities, with the intelligence to do the job. They are just looking for the guidance they've had their entire lives. And so leaning on them to, coach them versus just dismiss them as being, again, I hate using even the word lazy, as that is not my word, that is the conception of them, but it's simply not true. They are simply looking for mentoring and coaching in their positions. If we look at the next slide, we'll see sort of the leading traits of this generation is their empathy. Again, that blend of bringing their personal with their professional to make strategic decisions, and then understanding the power of that cooperative, collaborative style, whether it's personal or professional, leaning on the experiences and keying in on that value that diversity brings to our groups, the strengths and the weaknesses of balancing each other out. That is what Gen Z is the first generation to sort of recognize that and bring that and lead with that. So if we go to our next slide, and this is again, sociological discussions and studies can sometimes feel very intangible, like, oh yeah, this applies to a bunch of people, but it doesn't apply to me because it's, the group study or the generalizations. But the fact of the matter is a ton of quantitative studies have been done as well. And this one by phone in March of 2022, over 1,500 people were took part in this survey by phone from ages 18 to 94, so the full spectrum of our generations. And when they were asked the broad question of just helping America solve its problems, this huge but vague concept, if we advance, you can see the totality, 96% either somewhat agreed or strongly agreed that by working intergenerationally, we could solve America's problems, whether that's education, whether that's healthcare, because we are keying in on the collective intelligence and experiences, the certain skills that each generation has learned and lived through based on their different events and conditions. And if we can take all of the values, all of the experiences, all of the skills from Woodstock to TikTok and smush them together in the potluck of generations, that's where we're going to see and harness the most potential and the most power to be productive and efficient and really, I think, happy, with one another working together. If we look at our last slide, it's just that overview that, we are better together. Whether it's, in this instance, it is taking advantage of those intergenerational experiences and taking care of those intergenerational, skills and mindsets. And when we take advantage of those differences, we do become a wiser and more inclusive organization. So if we advance to our last slide, I think, the general message that we like to promote with BridgeWorks, because it's what we've seen, it is what we've lived, it is what we've researched, is that our unique generational talents, again, from baby boomers to Gen Z, offers so much value to our organizations and communities if we can just work together and collaborate versus running into that generational friction. So that is sort of the overview of the generations and what we teach and believe here at BridgeWorks. Now is when I would love to pass it off to Daniel, Bonnie, and Connor. If there are specific questions that the audience had, I would love to address as best I can.
Kelly, we're so appreciative that you have taken this time to share with us your expertise and your knowledge. It is so clear that we're different, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and I loved how you closed, right? And how it is so evident that it is our diversity of experiences and values and skills and ideas that will help us truly identify solutions that meet everyone's needs, right? If we don't have a whole sector voice, we're likely going to have gaps in that area. However, it is a lot easier said than done, right? There are challenges that we face, and I think we all have experienced whether the strength of collaboration, but also the challenges around discomfort when it's not happening, lack of information when it's not happening, and challenges that emerge in the workplace, in the community, in society, in the family, like all around us. So as people get warmed up with questions, I like to ask a question. One of the pieces that the Center for Social Justice promotes as much as possible is the importance of slowing down to take the time to learn about those differences. Because you talked so eloquently about some of the reasons for which different generations behave in certain ways and have certain approaches and understand life and believe in things, right, in a particular way. And oh yeah, of course, right? That makes sense. And so because all of us have a different approach, and you mentioned the international reflection in generational diversity. Like I identify with that. I grew up in Mexico, and I noticed differences with people my age, right, in terms of how we grew up and how we see the world around us. The challenge that I often see is the seeming unsustainability of slowing down to do that, of taking that time to learn about where we come from and how we see things differently, what's important to us, why we approach things one way or another, in order as a return investment strategy, right? Not just as a or a respectful thing to do, which it is, but as a way to do our work more effectively and even more efficiently, right? Because going back to redesign something is very expensive. What would be your recommendation or your thoughts regarding how can we make time for that, right? How can we help ourselves and our systems to see that value and to strategize to fit that into our processes and conversations and interactions to make sure that we're leveraging our diversity?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is so ubiquitous as far as, everybody sees time as money, right? And right from the trainings, the hiring of someone, it's like, let's rush to get them because they need to be producing as fast as they can, no matter, what our production looks like, whether it's in sales, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in education. But you're absolutely right. And what I like to remind people, especially leaders, right? You are in a leadership position because your organization sees something in you about how you connect with people, right? Because you could be, the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of people out there who are really, really good at their job. Let's say, like an accountant. You could be the best accountant in the world. But the second you get promoted to be the lead of the accounting department, things could fall apart because you are trained to work with numbers. You are not trained to work with people. So the first thing I would say is, if you are a leader who is feeling this time crunch, who is feeling this pressure, take a breath and realize you are in this position to handle the people. The people that are under your guidance are looking to you to be the example, to be the person who helps fix problems, to be the person who, makes them want to work. And it's often said, people don't leave jobs, people leave people. And so if you can take a moment, even from day one, to take a second and say, tell me about you, tell me about, where you come from, tell me about your work style, tell me, what you see with your future with this company. It could be literally a 1-day process in your orientation of a new person to your department, to your company, to whatever the case may be, to understand and connect with them. And if I'm on the other side of that table, if I am someone who is sitting down for a potential job or a potential movement within my company, and that manager takes the time on day one to say, I see you, I am connecting with you, I want you to know I am here for you. Oh my gosh, that is going to mean so much to me because I think so many organizations don't do that. And that, hour meeting at the very beginning, like you said, if you think about the return on that investment, now you have somebody who is committed to working hard for you, who knows and feels seen and feels a connection to you. It's going to be harder for them to walk away from your organization because they feel valued. And the more valued people feel, the more engaged they are in their work. And not only that, but think about our society today and how, our cancel culture and viral things and, word of mouth, how fast, bad news spreads. It's like the same can be said of good news. Like if you're in an organization that is building these strong connections with people, and I'm one of those people, I'm going to go tell my friends, like, you guys, my company is amazing. My manager is amazing. And now you're building this culture, you're building this reputation as being an organization that values their people. And you're going to have to start turning people away instead of, entering that endless retention and recycle process. So I do think, like you said, it is hard. It is not easy. And people do have the like their schedules these days are crazy, right? People can work around the clock from anywhere, and some do. And that's heartbreaking as well because we need to take time to take care of ourselves. But if you can sit down on day one, create a connection, create a dialogue with your people, I think there's going to be more investment and more success down the road, regardless of what generation they come from.
Thank you, Kelly. I know that there's a question in the chat and there's a question in the Q&A space. Bonnie, could you ask Sharon's question?
Sure. We need a t-shirt that says I'm on mute. So Sharon says, I'm from the silent generation. I'm halfway through my Excelsior master's program. Go, Sharon. How can I help solve the problems America faces? By the way, I'm not, nor am I willing to be silent.
Love it. I love that. Sharon, it was. I appreciate your input. You are amazing getting your master's. Congratulations for that. A lot of times, and this is, yes, kudos. And this is something leaning into, again, what organizations can do for us. So I'll address that first because I think it's important. If you are in an organization, this could be something you bring to the table, whether it's an educational program or your job. But a lot of times, generations will not mix because they don't feel they have commonalities or reasons to mix, right? Like if I'm a millennial, I may not feel like I have a lot in common with a baby boomer. So even in my organic sort of little mini moments at work where I could connect with people, I'm likely to choose people who I feel I have something in common with, which is likely going to be another millennial. So by creating programs that quote unquote force intergenerational activity like mentor programs, there are so many studies out there that say when you give people a structured format to connect, both sides, whether it's younger and older or, female and male, when you give them the opportunity or force them together, both sides report satisfaction and learning things they wouldn't have otherwise learned. But a lot of times they won't do it on their own. It can feel daunting, it can feel uncomfortable. People don't like to leave their comfort zone. So by creating programs that give you a formatted, structured way to interact with people who are different from you, I think is the best thing you can do, Sharon. So if you're in a program, say, hey, we should do, partner projects, and you should pick somebody who is in a different generation, or you should do, you're in the workplace, let's do a mentor program, and you should pick somebody from a different generation, because at this point, there are things younger generations can teach older generations about technology or about social media that it can feel daunting or embarrassing to ask about, but when you're given a platform where it's like, hey, this is our reason for connecting, it's much easier to make those inroads and those connections. Hopefully that helped, Sharon.
Kelly, we have a question in the chat. Elaine said, this was an excellent presentation, although I'm curious what these generational differences look like in other cultures, since each country and culture has its own historical events that drastically impact each generation differently. For example, those living in rural areas are probably able to relate more to baby boomers and even earlier generations if they lived relatively off-grid. So the question is, how would you encourage institutions to assess individual and cultural differences as well when considering generational differences?
Oh gosh, that is a loaded and insightful question, and you're absolutely right. I have done presentations across the country, and our organization has actually done presentations across the globe. And you are so right. I have had feedback from members. I just did one for a big tech company, and I had a gentleman come up to me and say he was raised in a village in Africa. And so, they didn't have cell phones until, the early 2000s for anybody. And even then, they were very, very limited. So you're absolutely right in your recognition of how those other dimensions of generations can change based on the culture, the geography, socioeconomic status, all of those. In terms of addressing it, again, I think because there could be so many individual variants, having some sort of generational training like BridgeWorks provides for organizations at least creates the awareness, because we may not have the time or the resources to do every single individual. But if we open a greater dialogue and say, hey, this is what this is about, and these are the different dimensions that we have in play, you now have an awareness and can appreciate someone else a little bit more. And it might open up that dialogue. Again, if you're a leader and you're having trouble connecting with someone, you think this has worked with my other people who are in this position. Why is this not working with you? And then you hear this presentation where it's like, well, could be a generation, it could be a culture generational thing. And now you have the awareness to say, okay, I'm going to sit down with this person. I realize how I have coached or mentored or how this position has worked for others in the past isn't working. Let's talk about how we can change it so that it works for you. Because again, you as an individual, it is not being different is not a character flaw, right? Being a Gen Z versus a baby boomer, these are not flaws. We are not right or wrong as different generations. We are simply different. And it's appreciating, it's understanding, it's being aware of those differences, and then working with people to connect in a way that you may not have thought to connect otherwise. I wish I had a better answer, but that's, like I said, there are so many dimensions on how we're different from generations and the different cultures. I think it starts with awareness.
Thank you, Kelly. We have, you might have already started to respond to this question, but we have Diane Walter who asked, what resource would you recommend for us leaders who are baby boomers?
That's a great question. You know, and off the top of my head, the first thing, honestly, that comes to mind, just because it is becoming so prevalent, is AI. You know, asking AI programs, you know, what are generational differences from a baby boomer to the other generations on X dimension? You know, if I'm communicating, I'm a baby boomer. What are things I can do? And you know, AI is smart. You know, it is artificial intelligence being the key word. And that's a great way, again, to at least get a better recognition for what some of the differences are. And like I mentioned, you know, the strength of the baby boomers is their lived experience. So maybe taking some of what the books or the artificial intelligence says and then blending it with your own personal experience. Because I think, like I mentioned, I think baby boomers have a ton of lived experience that you simply can't teach. And so leaning on sort of your instincts and just that lived experience that you've had and taking advantage of that.
That's such a wonderful response. And so says Diane as well. I wish we had time, one, for more questions, and two, to read to you all the appreciation comments that are flowing in the chat. But they're really wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for
Yes.
being here, for being present. And I hope, and correct me, Kelly, if I'm going on a tangent, but I hope that one of the major takeaways of today is the importance of asking questions, right? If we can get in the mindset of, what do I not know? What piece of information am I missing? What perspective am I not considering? That will automatically lead me in the direction of figuring out whom should I include, with whom should I collaborate, to whom should I ask certain this and that question, with whom should I make sure that what I'm doing is full and complete and systemic. That to me is not just something that we need to be thinking about. It is social justice. And in this very competitive environment, including higher education, it is a responsibility, it's a requirement of our ability to function, to survive, and to thrive. So I'm hoping that we leave this place thinking, what questions should I ask? Who else should I include, right? How can I learn more about these differences that I might not be as fully aware of that I need to consider? So this has been wonderful. Kelly, I'll give you the last word for us to close before
Yeah.
we
Well, I
finish the
think, Daniel,
session.
that was a very poignant and insightful thought. Is, again, it is about awareness, it is about openness, and I think everyone appreciates being able to voice, you know, how they're feeling and what they're feeling. And sometimes just being invited to share your voice is all that it takes to, you know, smooth out whatever friction may be happening in your personal or professional lives. And from a BridgeWorks standpoint, a lot of it does come from generational appreciation, and whether it's misunderstanding or understanding, but being able to bridge those generational gaps and harness the collective power of everybody, I think, is what we hope these presentations allow and encourage.
Well, Kelly, you left us with a lot to think about and a lot of great things we learned and hunger for us to learn more. So we really appreciate your insight, your time, your willingness to share with us your experience. And everybody, thank you so much for your
Yes.
participation. Let's continue the work. It is very important. And if you are interested in this topic, we have an age and generational diversity road team where we have constantly flowing information, updated content of all different types, and your capability to share with us what you know. So please don't hesitate. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you. We'll see you next time.